Are you familiar with the trolley problem? Or a situation where a man needs to choose who to save in his family? What if you are involved in these situations? Let me explain further. The person can choose to divert the train from the main track, saving 5 people on the track, but killing the worker on the other, and vice versa if you do nothing. Given that you are the person close to the lever, whom will you choose to save? And what if the only worker on the other side is your family member? Here's another situation. A husband needs to choose whom to save between his pregnant wife and their unborn baby. What if it is you that are pregnant, the husband, or their other child? What will your decision be? It seems like you are now in complete loss of thought. But don't worry. We're here to discuss Unit 5 Analysis of Ethical Theories, Modules 1 to 3, that could help you face moral dilemmas of life. Let's start with the bare minimum requirements of an ethical theory. With these elements, it must provide a definition of good, of what is right in terms of the good, and a clear and certain statement of the moral principle. Philosophers make a clear distinction of the good between intrinsic and instrumental good. Your intelligence, for example, and capability are instrumental good because you use it to attain the intrinsic good, which are your achievements. After defining what is good, the next issue is what is right. The moral obligation question of what you ought to do. If you are a teleologist, you will judge the rightness of an act by its consequences, while a deontologist will judge by the nature of the act alone. In the trolley problem, you are a teleologist if you pull the lever and chose to save the 5 people because you save more lives. However, in a deontologist perspective, whatever you do is wrong because you chose to sacrifice the other person and let him die. The teleology has 2 versions that shows their view regarding the beneficiary of the good, which are the egoism and utilitarianism. Egoism says that any action that maximizes the good for oneself is right, while utilitarianism is based on the beneficiary of the good or for the greatest number. A quantitative hedonist defines good as purely pleasure, while a qualitative hedonist defines good as intellectual pleasure. The opposite of this is non-hedonism. Moving on to Jeremy Bentham's principle of utility, which is used to measure the potential of an act to produce happiness and avoid pain, and its intended beneficiary is either the individual or the community. To measure pleasure and pain and determine their respective amount, we look for its intensity, duration, certainty or uncertainty, and its propinquity or remoteness. When in doubt regarding the value of pleasure or pain in estimating the tendency of an act by which it is produced, we look for its fecundity, or the possibility that pleasure will be followed by another pleasure, purity, or the possibility that pleasure will be followed by pain, and extent or the number of people getting affected by it. Lastly, let's dig deeper about utilitarianism. According to the greatest happiness principle, activities are moral if they promote utility, but immoral if they reduce utility. For this purpose, utility is defined as happiness without suffering. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person believes it is attainable and desires his own happiness. There's also the idea of ideal utilitarianism, which says that actions are right or wrong, as their intention to produce for mankind is an ideal end or good. For the application of utility principle, we have the act and rule utilitarian. In act utilitarian, they respond to the basic question of which action has the greatest potential for maximizing the good and minimizing pain, while in rule utilitarian, they respond to the basic question of What rules, if followed by everyone all the time, will maximize the good in the world? In the trolley problem situation, given that the only person on the other side is a relative, an utilitarian would advise you not to pull the lever to save him. It maximizes the pleasure and minimizes the pain that could be brought by a loss of a relative, while a rule utilitarian would do the other, as they are very specific not to go against their general rules. Notice that the distinction between act and rule utilitarian can cause profound conflict in making decisions, especially when confronted with a moral dilemma. If you do things that make people happy and don't cause any harm, you would likely believe that you're doing the right thing, and doing the right thing is moral, right? But there are situations where no decision would be considered totally without harm or pain, and situations where it's difficult to determine which action is the better option when it comes to choosing between two actions or activities, just like the situations we gave you at the start of this video. So, how do you make sure you're doing everything correctly? To put it in another way, you'll have to make the most ethical decisions you can for yourself and others, and then make sure you can live with them in the long run. Determine how you want your life, as well as the lives of people around you, to be.
Hello everyone, we are Group 11 and today we're going to talk about Acuñas' book, which is Unit 5, Module 1, 2, and 3, Analysis of Ethical Theory 2. Let's begin with Module 1. There are three elements of an ethical theory. A. It must provide a definition of good and its opposite bad. B. It must provide a definition of what is right in terms of the good. C. It must provide a statement of the moral principle in clear and certain terms. When you are comparing and contrasting ethical theories, ay dapat may tatlong element na ito dahil kapag wala to, you only have an incomplete theory. So next is the vocabulary used in moral philosophy. The first one is statement of value. This is the philosopher's concept of what is good. It estimates of the worth or value of an act, object, person, event, etc. For example, Angela is good, customer is right, and Angela is correct. While the statement of obligation is the philosopher's concept of what is right, because it is your duty and obligation and what you ought to do. This can take form of a prescriptive statement, you ought to do this, or in form of prescriptive statement, don't do this. And the best example of prescriptive statement is the 10 Commandments on the Bible. And according to Acuña, when people share a form of life and language game, they are likely to judge the worth and value of an act, object, or event in the same way. So next is we are going to differentiate intrinsic good and instrumental good. Intrinsic good is pursue for their own sake. Thus, they are the ends in themselves and not used as means for some other ends. And Aristotle believes that happiness is the only intrinsic good, and this is the greatest good of all human life and the end of action. While instrumental good is the means for attaining some other good, the intrinsic good. Examples are wealth, intelligence, and beauty. And they are all used as means to attain the happiness, which is the intrinsic good. So we are also differentiating monist from pluralist. So monist is somebody who believes that only one thing is intrinsically good. Hedonism practiced by hedonists. So hedonism, only pleasure, is intrinsically good. While pluralist, there is more than one intrinsic good. Example, Plato believed in the mixed life, which says that there are a lot of elements such as beauty, intelligence, and etc. which make up the good. Next is deontologists and teleologists. Deontologists judges the rightness of an act by considering the act alone. The consequences of the act are unimportant. So basically, as long as you obey this act, then your actions are right. And no matter how consequences are bad, it still be considered right. While teleologies is the rightness of an act is judged in terms of its consequences. So although your act was considered good, but it yielded negative consequences, then the act is not good because the consequences are bad. Egoism and utilitarianism. Egoism is any action that maximizes the good for oneself is right. And it asks the question, what actions will maximize the greatest good for me? And people who practice egoism will do things that only for their self-interest. If you did something that benefits another person, yet you still expect that person to do the same good did to you, then it makes you an egoist because even though you did this for them, ginawa mo pa rin ito para sa iyong self-interest. Utilitarianism is any action that maximizes the good for a greater number of people. And it asks the question, what actions will maximize the good for the greatest number? So, yung pagkakaiba nilang dalawa is egoism ay self-directed while utilitarianism is other-directed.
Now let's move on to Module 2, teleological theories. On this module, we're going to discuss these two ethical systems, the teleological and deontological. In teleological, it says that the consequence of the act determines whether the act is right or wrong. Example, si Robin Hood, he is stealing to help the poor, then this could be under this ethical system because ang reason o ang result ng action niya is to help others, which is good. Then pwede makonsider yung act niya na tama. The nature of the act is not as important as the consequences of the act in determining whether it is right or wrong. While in deontological, the nature of the act determines whether it is right or wrong, kahit ano pang consequences niya. Pag dito natin in example yung kay Robin Hood, dun pa lang sa fact na he's stealing, kahit pa maganda naman yung purpose niya, it is still wrong because stealing isn't good. So, yun yung sinasabi ng dalawang ethical system na to. Now, we will compare and contrast the quantitative and qualitative hedonists. The basic disagreement among teleologists concerns the nature of the intrinsic good that is to be maximized or promoted. A quantitative hedonist defines good as purely pleasure, while a qualitative hedonist defines good as intellectual pleasure. These two hedonists believe that there is only one intrinsic good. Therefore, they are monists na dinefine naman na natin kanina sa Module 1. Non-hedonism is its opposite, which believes that there are many things that are intrinsically good. Hence, they are pluralist, and this version of teleology is dubbed as utilitarianism. The main contrast between teleological theories is their view regarding the beneficiary of the good. Egoism, the theory is in the form of egoism if the beneficiary is the moral agent himself. They live with the maxim, thus the act promotes the greatest good or pleasure for me. And an egoistic hedonist is concerned only with his own self-interest. On the other hand, utilitarian argues and live with the maxim that one must maximize the good for the greatest number. These are the ideologies presented by groups of philosophers called the Cyrenaics and Epicureans. For Cyrenaics, intellectual pleasure will suffer in comparison with the pleasures of the body. They said that pleasures of the senses deserve the highest priority, and our anticipation of future pleasures has no bearing on the present. They suggest to maximize the pleasure of the moment. Or in our generation, it is the so-called YOLO. You only live once, so learn to enjoy every moment. Well, for Epicurus, a Greek philosopher and the most famous egoistic hedonist in the history of thought, along with the Epicureans, are against the Cyrenaics attitudes. According to the former, the highest pleasure that should be sought after is absence of pain in the body and mind. They believe that the good life is the life of the body
and mental calm spent in the company of friends or loved ones. The principle of utility. Jeremy Bentham, the modern exponent of the limited utilitarianism, because as he emphasized, his point of reference is the parochial view of his community and not the whole of humanity. Bentham turned David Hume's concept of utility, which says that utility was the foundation of ethics, the foundation of justice and benevolence, into full-fledged moral philosophy. In Bentham's principle of utility, it is intended to measure the potential of an act to produce happiness and avoid pain. And the intended beneficiary of utility is either the individual or the community. Bentham says that everyone is to count for one and no one for more than one. Sinasabi niya na everybody should be taken in consideration every time a moral choice is made and a moral act is done. However, he seems ambivalent because he also has idea or principle of self-preference where he defends egoism. He is contradicting himself kasi nung una sinabi na niya na a person whose choices is motivated by self-interest cannot be counted on to pursue the interests of the whole unless there is a pre-established harmony between personal and social interests. Bentham, by having these contradicting ideas regarding personal interest and social interest, he invented the hedonic calculus. So, what is this hedonic calculus? It is used to help us calculate or measure the quantity of pleasure. The first criteria is this: to measure pleasure and pain and determine their respective amount. First is its intensity, its duration, its certainty or uncertainty, and fourth is its propinquity or remoteness. The second one is when you are in doubt regarding the value of pleasure or pain in estimating the tendency of an act by which it is produced, here is the criteria for this. Its fecundity, its purity, and its extent. For its meaning, fecundity refers to the possibility that pleasure will be followed by another of the same kind. Purity refers to the possibility that pleasure will be followed by its opposite, which is pain. And extent refers to the number of people to whom it extends, that is, who are affected by it.
Module 3 of Unit 5 is all about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the most influential moral philosophy in the last 2 centuries, and Jeremy Bentham is the acknowledged founder. So sinabi na kinuha daw ni Bentham yung principle of utility kay David Hume, and Bentham admitted it. The popular attraction of Bentham ethics is easy to understand and simple to apply. Next is quantitative hedonism. Quantitative hedonism, scholars Bentham believes that this was the source of his insight that moral goodness is democratic. And this is alternative is your moral obligation. That is, this is what you ought to do. It is purely quantitative. In order to access the moral worth of an action, it being good as far as it promoted pleasure and bad as far as it promoted pain. The right action is one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. Now we are done discussing Jeremy Bentham and his moral philosophy. Let's proceed to John Stuart Mill. So sino nga ba siya? John Stuart Mill is the most famous utilitarian. He laid the foundation of his moral philosophy by stating that there is an ultimate good, a summum bonum. All moral action should be aimed at attaining this good, and Mill insists that this good is happiness. So the greatest happiness principle, the ultimate end with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desirable. So it is an existent exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyments both in point of quantity and quality. Mill states his theological position by insisting the rightness of an action is determined by the actual consequences. So, hindi mo daw makikita o malalaman yung rightness ng isang action by just simply examining the nature of the act alone. And the real value of our actions depends on whether it promotes the good or not. Even though parehas na utilitarian si Mill at Bentham, they have the differences. Mill is against by the purely quantitative treatment of principle of utility ni Bentham. Here is the quotation from Mill. It is better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So para mas maintindihan natin ito, mag-proceed muna tayo dito sa qualitative hedonism. Qualitative hedonism, Mill against the purely quantitative treatment of the principal utility. Epicurus espoused the view that while the good life is the life of pleasure, he does not mean only bodily and sensual pleasure. Sabi, mayroon pa daw higher forms like intellectual and spiritual pleasure. According to both philosophers, Philo and Epicurus, some pleasures are intrinsically superior to others. So the question is, what is the criterion for judging the quality of pleasure? The example given by Mill is Socrates acquainted with both bodily pleasure and intellectual pleasure. So kapag daw tinanong mo si Socrates, which is form of pleasure, is more desirable, Mill said, obviously, he will choose intellectual pleasure. So the criterion for judging which pleasure is better than another must be made who has experienced both kinds of pleasures. So talaga mapapaisip tayo what is considered as higher pleasure and lower pleasure. So sabi is the higher pleasure consists of the more intellectual, artistic, and even spiritual. The example of these are reading poetry, speculating about nature, enjoying the music, and the visual arts. As opposed to the more sensual and physical, like eating good food, indulging sex, and other physical stimulation. Pero take note that Mill is not excluding the lower pleasures from the consideration. It just that he personally prefers higher pleasure. So, from the quotation earlier, it is the pig that provides the model for lower pleasure. In contrast, it is Socrates who exemplifies the quest for higher pleasure.
The continuation of Module 3, Proof of the Principle of Utility. Mill's proof of the soundness of the principle of utility is the sole evidence. Is it possible to produce that anything is desirable? Is that people to actually desire it? For example, no general reason can be given why happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desire his own happiness. Mill's proof has been the subject of debate among utilitarian scholars because of this. According to Solomon, the most generous interpretation of this proof is the following. First is, one's own happiness or pleasure is the only thing desired by each person. The second is, the happiness of all is the only thing desired for itself by all. Third is, the only test of something's being desirable is its being desired. Number 4 is, the general happiness is the only thing desired in itself. The last one is, the only test of the rightness or wrongness of actions is their tendency to promote the general happiness or their tendency to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And to tell you, this so-called proof doesn't help Mill to make people criticize him less. Instead, this has been the source of too much unfair criticism against him. Non-hedonistic utilitarianism. Hastings Rachdale is the typical exponent of this third form of utilitarianism. Non-hedonism implies the broadest category of the pluralistic definition of good. Included in its list are beauty, knowledge, wisdom, temperance, and of course, pleasure. and all this good must be maximized for everyone. Rational called the view of ethics, which combines the utilitarian principle that ethics must be teleological with the non-hedonistic view of the ethical end, an ideal utilitarianism. What is ideal utilitarianism then? Actions are right or wrong according as they tend to produce for mankind an ideal end or good, which includes but not limited to pleasure. It is in pluralistic view which differentiates Rashdal to Bentham and Mill. Here, Rashdal espouses a pluralistic concept of the good to be the ideal end. Let's define the act utilitarian and rule utilitarian. For act utilitarian, morality is the maximization of pleasure and minimization of pain. They respond to the basic question of which action has the greatest potential for maximizing the good and minimizing pain. While for rule utilitarian, the focal point of attention of it is the rules and not specific acts. They respond to the basic question of what rules, if followed by everyone all of the time, will maximize the good in the world. Look at this for example. You are confronted with dilemma. Either you cheat in an exam or you don't. If you cheat, you will pass the course and you will be happy. However, if you don't cheat, you will fail the course and acquire pain in the form of embarrassment. An act utilitarian will advise you to cheat because it maximizes the pleasure or the good once you pass the course and minimizes a lot of embarrassment or the pain. While the rule utilitarian will advise you not to cheat because this will not calculate the balance of pleasure over pain for this specific act. The utility of the rule is the act of cheating. And this act of cheating is against the rule of intellectual honesty. As it violates the rule, it is morally wrong. Notice that the distinction between act and rule utilitarian can cause profound conflict in making decisions, especially when confronted with a moral dilemma. In general, all of what we've discussed is only to give you more knowledge of how philosophers think and suggest to people how to overcome and come up with a decision when confronted by a moral dilemma. But it is still up to you, your values, and the factors involved that are needed to consider to decide what action to take. That's all, and thank you for listening.